On a fateful day in the late summer or fall of 701 BCE, an Assyrian general known as the Rabshakeh was standing by the conduit of the upper pool near the northern part of Jerusalem's city wall. He was waiting for envoys from the city. The Rabshakeh had a message to convey, a message that would deeply disturb Eliakim, Hilkiah, and Shebna, the three high officials whom Hezekiah, the king of Judah, had sent outside to negotiate with him. What the Rabshakeh had to say to them meant that Jerusalem was facing its last days as the capital of an independent kingdom. King Sennacherib of Assyria would take over, and resistance was futile. The Rabshakeh's message was vivid with menace. If Hezekiah thought he could rely on Egypt, the Rabshakeh noted, he would be making a grave mistake. Egypt was a broken reed of a staff, which will pierce the hand of anyone who leans on it. It would certainly not be able to help the Judean king, and if Hezekiah hoped that a divine intervention would save him, he was mistaken as well. Is it without the Lord that I myself have come up against this place to destroy it? The Rabshakeh says, quoting Sennacherib, his royal master, and invoking the biblical God. Using another rhetorical question and alluding to the Assyrian practice of god-napping, he then asks, has any of the gods of the nations ever delivered its land out of the hands of the king of Assyria? Where are the gods of Hamath and Arpad? And finally, in the rhetorically most ambitious part of his speech, the Rabshakeh points out why the people of Jerusalem need not be afraid of submitting to Assyria, even though this might lead to their eventual deportation. Thus says the king of Assyria, make your peace with me and come out to me. Then every one of you will eat from your own vine and your own fig tree, and drink water from your own cistern, until I come and take you away to a land like your land, a land of grain and wine, a land of bread and vineyards, a land of olive oil and honey, that you may live and not die. The Rabshakeh's speech is a masterclass in psychological warfare, and Hezekiah's negotiators were aware of the potential ramifications if word got out about what he had said. Worried that the Assyrian general might persuade the people of Jerusalem with his eloquent reasoning, grounded in realpolitik as well as theology, the Judean officials beg him not to conduct the negotiations so openly. Please speak to your servants in the Aramaic language, for we understand it. Do not speak to us in the language of Judah within the hearing of the people who are on the wall. But the Rabshakeh declines this request. His use of the language of Judah, that is Hebrew rather than Aramaic, at the time the language of international diplomacy in the Levant, is quite deliberate. The Rabshakeh wants to communicate directly with the people sitting on the wall who, he says, addressing the officials but also speaking to everyone else, would be doomed with you to eat their own dung and to drink their own urine if they were confined in Jerusalem for much longer. The words of the Rabshakeh are from one of the many stories that were told about the Assyrian attack on Judah in 701 BCE. The biblical account found both in 2 Kings 18-19 and Isaiah 36-37. The different reports, the ones in the Bible and those from other sources, reflect a wide variety of different perspectives and were written down at different times. Separating facts from fiction and establishing what really happened at Jerusalem in 701 BCE has proven to be a puzzle, and scholars to this day continue to squabble about it. Sennacherib's attack on Judah in 701 BCE can, in some respects, be called the first world event. In addition to Assyrians and Judeans, it involved Egyptians, Nubians, Phoenicians, Philistines, the Transjordanian kingdoms, and possibly even Babylonians and Arabs. It is described in Assyrian sources, in several books of the Hebrew Bible, and in the work of the Greek historian Herodotus. But the most important reason for dwelling on the campaign of 701 in some detail is that it had a significant impact on Assyria's later reputation. As time went by, the conflict between Sennacherib and the Judean king Hezekiah became part of the cultural memory of a wide range of pre-modern and even modern civilizations far beyond the Middle East and the Mediterranean. For modern historians, the availability of so many sources is in many respects a blessing. Where else in their study of the ancient Near East can they draw on equally abundant documentation? But this embarrassment of riches also holds its challenges, because the available texts often contradict one another. The greatest contradiction of all is that whereas the Bible claims the Assyrians ended up suffering a major defeat at Jerusalem, the Assyrian sources present the campaign as a great Assyrian triumph. Since the mid-19th century, historians and religious scholars have tried to resolve such tensions. Because the reliability of the Bible was in the balance, the stakes were high. Many researchers were guided to an unusual degree by the agendas of their times or their personal beliefs. Taking a closer look at Sennacherib's attack on Judah therefore not only brings into sharper focus an important moment in Assyrian history, one that decisively shaped the memory of Assyria in later tradition, but also teaches some important lessons about the writing of history in general and the extrinsic factors that tend to influence it. Sennacherib, Sargon II's successor, had ascended the Assyrian throne in 705 BCE. His reign was in several regards remarkable, with many achievements. Under Sennacherib, the city of Nineveh, Assyria's new capital, was transformed into a metropolis of spectacular splendor, eventually covering some 750 hectares, 1,850 acres, more than twice the size of Karna or Dur-Sharrukin. It became the largest and possibly the wealthiest city the world had ever seen. By the end of Sennacherib's reign, Nineveh featured several massive new palaces, temples, and arsenals, as well as gigantic boulevards well-suited for triumphal processions and military parades, all within a wall 12 kilometers, 7.5 miles long, equipped with towers, buttresses, and 18 colossal gates. New metalworking techniques were invented, allegedly by none other than Sennacherib himself, to facilitate the production of monumental bronze statues of winged bulls and lions, among other things, and it was mostly during the reign of Sennacherib that, in response to slowly diminishing amounts of annual precipitation, a network of interconnected canals, aqueducts, and navigable waterways was constructed in the hilly northern sectors of Assyria's core territory to irrigate previously barren land. Among the farmers and gardeners recruited to work the new fields and orchards now blanketing the region were thousands of resettled deportees. But there was also trouble. The shadow of Sargon's violent hand loomed large over Sennacherib's time and power. Apart from affecting the king and his entourage psychologically, it had major political implications. When news of Sargon's untimely death had spread across the empire, it encouraged recently conquered areas and vassal kingdoms on almost every front to seek to regain their independence. As a result, from his earliest days in power, Sennacherib found himself forced to devote much of his time and energy to fighting against rebels, rather than further expanding the empire's geographic horizons. The majority of Sennacherib's military campaigns were directed against Babylonia, where opposition against his rule was particularly fierce. The north and the east were occasional targets of Assyrian attacks as well. But the king's most widely discussed military operation, counted in his annals as his third campaign, was aimed at the pacification of the western Levant, where dozens of political leaders had united in yet another attempt to cast off the Assyrian yoke. Sennacherib's earliest account of his third campaign dates to the second month of the year 700 BCE, a few months after the bulk of the Assyrian army had returned home. It was inscribed on clay cylinders that were buried in the foundations of various buildings in Nineveh and Ashur, where later kings were expected to find and study them. Excavators have uncovered no fewer than 8 complete exemplars of these cylinders, and some 80 fragments of them, which establishes beyond doubt that Sennacherib and his court historians must have attributed considerable importance to the events they describe. Sennacherib presents his third campaign as a sequence of several episodes: the flight of the king of Sidon, the submission of unfaithful vassals, the punishment of Ashkelon, an armed conflict with the Philistine city of Ekron and its Egyptian allies, and finally, as the climax of the whole operation, the Assyrian attack on the kingdom of Judah, It is clear that these episodes were actually interrelated and included events that must have happened simultaneously. But an exact timeline for them is hard to establish. The Assyrian troops had made their way to the western Levant in the summer of 701 without facing much opposition. If we are to believe Sennacherib's annals, and there is no reason not to in this case, their arrival in the region was enough to prompt one of the ringleaders of the rebellion, King Luli of Sidon, to abandon the cause and flee afar into the midst of the sea. Later versions of the annals reveal that Luli found exile on Cyprus, where he seems to have died. He was replaced by a pro-Assyrian king by the name of Hubaru, who was also given power over the mainland sectors of Tyre. The heavily fortified island city of Tyre remained unconquered but refrained from interfering with the Assyrian operations. As a result of this initial success, Sennacherib claims, several former vassals came forward to resume the annual payments they owed the Assyrians. Among them were the leaders of the cities of Samsumaruna, Sidon, Arwad, and Byblos in Phoenicia, the city of Ashdod in Philistia, which had been a short-lived Assyrian province after 711, and the lands of Ammon, Moab, and Edom east of the Jordan River. Their tribute is described by Sennacherib as having been fourfold, which must mean that the rulers who brought it provided reparations for the missing deliveries of the years that had passed since the beginning of the revolt in 705 BCE. Whether they all gathered in Phoenicia or made their payments locally remains unclear. Such willingness to submit to Assyria was far from universal, however, and several pockets of resistance remained. Some were more easily dealt with than others. In Ashkelon, the Assyrians quickly gained the upper hand. They captured King Sidka, who was probably betrayed by his own people, and brought him, together with his wife, sons, daughters, brothers, and family gods, to Assyria. The new king Sennacherib installed in Ashkelon had an Assyrian name, Sharuludari, may the Assyrian king last forever, which suggests that he had been a hostage in Assyria and had gone through a thorough re-education program before being sent back home. Not everywhere, however, was the popular sentiment so much in favor of yielding to the pressure the Assyrians exerted. In the city of Ekron, some 35 kilometers, 22 miles, west of Jerusalem, anti-Assyrian rebels were determined not to back down. According to Sennacherib's account, the revolt in Ekron had started with local officials and other citizens deposing their pro-Assyrian ruler, King Padi, and handing him over to Hezekiah of Judah. It must have been a major force in the rebellion from very early on, when Ekron's new leaders realized that an Assyrian army was on its way to them. They decided to carry on the fight. But they knew they needed outside help if they were to have any chance of victory in the impending showdown. They found it in Egypt. At the time of Sennacherib's third campaign, Egypt was ruled by the 25th or Kushite dynasty, whose origins lay in the region of Napata in northern Sudan. The Kushites seem to have established themselves in Egypt shortly after 730 BCE. Around 720 BCE, Pharaoh Shabaka moved northward and consolidated Kushite power over Lower Egypt and the Nile Delta. Many of the local dynasties, often of Libyan background, that had ruled there for some time formally stayed in place, but were deprived of sovereign power. The Kushites had thus reunited most of Egypt again, bringing a long period of political fragmentation to an end. Today, the kings of Kushite dynasty are often called the Black Pharaohs. This is to some extent in line with how they were perceived at the time of their rule. Esarhaddon writes about the wives, sons, and daughters of Taharka, the 25th dynasty's penultimate ruler, but their bodies, like his, have skins as black as pitch. Outsiders as they were, probably not so much because of their dark complexion as that they were a people from beyond the traditional borders of Egypt. The Kushites adopted Egyptian culture with particular zeal. The inscriptions of their kings abound in allusions to the great works of classical Egyptian literature. In this regard, the Kushites were actually quite similar to the Assyrians, who showed comparable enthusiasm in their endeavors to make Babylonian culture their own. The rulers of the 25th dynasty also shared some of Assyria's political goals. Both monarchies had similar geostrategic interests in the southern Levant, a region Egypt had always considered part of its own sphere of influence, but that was now increasingly under the sway of imperial Assyria. Undoubtedly, the intelligence services of the two superpowers kept a very close eye on the activities of the other side in the region. An open conflict between them was only a matter of time. Already early in the reign of Sargon II, an Egyptian general by the name of Raya was involved in skirmishes with Assyrian troops at Rafia south of Gaza. Later in 711 BCE, Pharaoh Shabaka granted asylum to an anti-Assyrian rebel from Ashdod by the name of Yamani. Shabaka's successor, Shebitku, who ascended the throne in 707 BCE, extradited Yamani to Sargon in a gesture of goodwill. But Kushite Egypt remained wary of Assyria consolidating its power in Philistia and neighboring regions. When the people of Ekron needed their assistance against the advancing Assyrian troops, the Kushites and their client rulers in Lower Egypt were therefore ready to spring into action. They arrived on the scene speedily and with considerable resources. As Sennacherib's annals put it, the kings of Lower Egypt and the archers, chariots, and horses of the king of Meluhah, that is Cush, forces without number, came to their aid. Near the small city of Eltekeh, probably somewhere north of Ashdod, the Assyrian and Egyptian troops met in pitched battle. Sennacherib contended that he scored a great victory over the enemy and captured many charioteers, as well as a number of Egyptian princes. But there have been doubts about this claim. Several modern scholars have argued that for the Assyrians the battle was a draw at best. Their critical assessment is partly based on a strange passage in the histories of the Greek writer Herodotus, which reports that the army of Sennacherib, king of the Arabians and the Assyrians, had pitched camp at Pelusium in the eastern Nile Delta when it was attacked at night by large numbers of field mice. The mice gnawed through the strings of the Assyrian bows and the handles of the Assyrian shields, so that on the next day the Egyptian king, whom Herodotus calls Sethos, scored an easy victory over the now unarmed Assyrians. Does Herodotus's report, surreal as it is, somehow reflect what happened at Eltekeh in 701? All in all, despite its awareness of a battle between Sennacherib and Egyptian troops, the account seems more a story than history, but the matter is difficult to decide. An argument in favor of the accuracy of Sennacherib's own version of the Eltekeh episode is what Assyrian sources most likely accurately claim occurred thereafter. The Assyrians approached the city of Ekron, killed the leaders and noblemen who had committed crimes, and hung their corpses on towers around the city. Only those who had not joined the rebels were spared. None of this, it can be reasoned, would have been possible if the Assyrian army had not somehow managed to repel the Egyptian enemy troops at Eltekeh. A third source that mentions the Assyro-Egyptian confrontation does not fully settle the matter either. The Bible reports that the Egyptian troops fighting against Sennacherib had been led by Taharka, the later Kushite king and perhaps a general at the time. But it does not say anything specific about who really won the battle. Eventually, according to Sennacherib's annals, Ekron's former king, Padi, was brought back from his captivity in Jerusalem and reinstated in his office, of course in the expectation that he would henceforth pay the required tribute again. Padi's repatriation, though, cannot have happened right away. It must have been a result of Sennacherib's war with Hezekiah of Judah, which is the topic of the final and best known section of the king's report about his third campaign. Sennacherib describes his operation against Judah as a triumphant success. He begins by saying that he surrounded and conquered 46 of Hezekiah's fortified walled cities and smaller settlements in their environs, with the help of ramps and siege engines and through breaches made in the city walls. Corroborating evidence for this claim is found in the Bible, which reports that in the 14th year of King Hezekiah, King Sennacherib of Assyria came up against all the fortified cities of Judah and conquered them, a statement fully in line with the Assyrian account. The biblical passage goes on to observe that Hezekiah sent to the king of Assyria at Lachish to submit to him, suggesting that Lachish was one of the Judean cities seized by Sennacherib. and that the Assyrian king had set up his military headquarters nearby. Lachish, located some 40 kilometers 25 miles southwest of Jerusalem, is not mentioned by name in Sennacherib's annals. But the city makes a prominent appearance in a most impressive visual source from Assyria, a panoramic cycle of bas-reliefs, now on display in the British Museum in London, from room 36 of Sennacherib's palace at Nineveh. All extant reliefs from this room are devoted to the single theme of Sennacherib's siege and conquest of Lachish, which is identified by a cuneiform epigraph. The Lachish relief cycle, originally some 27 meters, 90 feet long, shows in consecutive order, on the left side Assyrian troops approaching the city, on the central panels, prominently positioned opposite the main entrance, the grim business of the siege itself, and on the right, the results of the operation, the relocation of the city's inhabitants, the punishment of evildoers, and gestures of submission towards Sennacherib, who is depicted sitting on an elaborately carved throne set up on a nearby hill. Particularly memorable scenes include Assyrian bowmen, slingers, and spearmen slowly ascending up a newly built ramp toward the upper portions of the city wall, with the defenders showering them from above with arrows and torches. Men and women leaving the city facing deportation, and some of the ringleaders of the rebellion being flayed or beheaded by Assyrian soldiers, while others are being impaled on wooden stakes, their wrists bound together, in a public spectacle that heralds the later practice of crucifixion. Other scenes show life in the Assyrian military camp and a family from Lachish, which includes a man, 2 women with headscarves, 3 girls, and a small boy on their way into exile, with a cart drawn by 2 malnourished oxen carrying their possessions. When intact, the Lachish relief cycle was some 67.5 square meters, 726.5 square feet in size. Especially when taking into account that the whole ensemble was originally painted, one must acknowledge it as one of the world's most imposing depictions of armed conflict from all times, on a par with famous monuments such as the Trajan Column in Rome, with its elaborate scenes from the Roman Emperor's Dacian Wars. What makes the Lachish reliefs truly outstanding is that they reveal in so much detail what warfare meant for both soldiers and civilians. Further evidence of the Assyrian siege and conquest of Lachish has also been found at Tel Ed-Duir, the actual site of the ancient city. Excavations there have established that nearly all the public and private buildings of Lachish, level 3, were destroyed in a massive conflagration that must have been brought about by marauding Assyrian soldiers. Remains of a large Assyrian siege ram built with stones weighing between 13,000 and 19,000 metric tons, 14,330 to 21,000 US tons in total, were discovered near the southwest corner of the city. Some 70 meters, 230 feet broad at its bottom, the ramp was faced at the top by a counter-ramp built by the defenders. The excavations in this area also produced almost 1,000 arrowheads, most of them made of iron, as well as numerous stone balls weighing about 250 grams 9 ounces each, that had served as sling stones. All this evidence shows how bloody and brutal the fight for Lachish must have been. The reliefs from Sennacherib's Lachish room seem to paint a fairly realistic picture of it. Sennacherib seized numerous Judean cities, most notably Lachish, but the Assyrian sources in the Bible agree that he failed to conquer the heavily fortified Judean capital of Jerusalem, the city where King Hezekiah resided. In Sennacherib's annals, the Jerusalem episode is, nonetheless, an Assyrian success story. Sennacherib claims that he confined Hezekiah inside Jerusalem, his royal city, like a bird in a cage, by setting up blockades that made it impossible for the king and his people to leave the city. Even though no actual siege seems to have taken place, and the Assyrian troops never entered Jerusalem, the annals state that Sennacherib's lordly brilliance eventually overwhelmed Hezekiah and prompted him to submit to the Assyrian king. In recognition of his new status as an Assyrian vassal, the Judean ruler sent precious gifts and various groups of people to the Assyrian court at Nineveh, outlined in considerable detail in Sennacherib's earliest account of his third campaign. The tribute included the auxiliary troops that had helped Hezekiah defend Jerusalem, possibly Arabs, but the matter is not quite clear. Several of the king's daughters, harem women and singers, and 30 talents of gold, 800 talents of silver, ivory beds, elephant hides, garments with multicolored trim, blue-purple wool, chariots, shields and lances, plus other luxury goods and weapons. According to the Assyrian account, Judah suffered moreover substantial territorial and demographic losses. Parts of its western domains were handed over to the Philistine cities of Ashdod, Ekron, and Gaza, and huge numbers of Judeans were relocated, even though the number of 200,150 deportees given in Sennacherib's annals is unrealistically high. How does the Assyrian version of the Jerusalem episode compare to the way the Bible describes this event? As already mentioned, a short passage at the beginning of the biblical account in 2 Kings 18, verses 13 to 15, paints a picture of Assyria's attack that is largely in line with the Assyrian sources, and thus most likely historically accurate. This also applies to the tribute listed in this section, allegedly taken by Hezekiah from the temple in Jerusalem and from the treasuries of his own palace. It is said to have included 300 talents of silver and 30 talents of gold, numbers close to or identical with the 30 talents of gold and 800 talents of silver the king paid the Assyrians according to Sennacherib's annals. But the biblical accounts of Sennacherib's Judean campaign are composite texts stitched together from different elements. The episode in 2 Kings 18, 13 to 15, seems to have been taken from a Hebrew chronicle that provides a largely factual account of the events. In the narrative segments following this passage, history, theology, and fiction are often inextricably intertwined. In the first and historically most plausible of these segments, it is stated that the king of Assyria sent the Tartan, the Rabsaris, and the Rabshakeh with a great army from Lachish to King Hezekiah at Jerusalem to enforce his submission. The three officials mentioned here bear actual Assyrian titles. They can be identified as the Assyrian field marshal, Tatarnu, the chief eunuch, Rabshareshi, and the chief cupbearer, Rabshakeh, respectively, all known to have led Assyrian military campaigns. What allegedly happened next was the event that opened this chapter. The Rabshakeh conveyed a message from Sennacherib requesting Hezekiah's surrender. It is unlikely that an Assyrian general spoke to Hezekiah's officials and the people of Jerusalem in exactly the way 2 Kings 18 suggests, but a similar speech may well have been delivered at the gates of Jerusalem. An Assyrian letter from 731 or 730 BCE provides an illuminating parallel. In it, 2 Assyrian officials informed King Tiglath-Pileser III about how they had tried to convince the citizens of Babylon to give up their support of Nabu-Mukhenzeri, a new Babylonian king who had taken an anti-Assyrian stance. The 2 officials write that on the 28th day of the month we went to Babylon, took our stand in front of the Marduk gate, and spoke with the citizens of Babylon. Zas-Sin-Nu, a servant of Mukhenzeri, and some Chaldeans who were with him came out too, standing with the citizens of Babylon in front of the gate. We spoke to the citizens of Babylon as follows: "The king has sent us to you." The situation described here is remarkably similar to the Rabshakeh episode in the Bible, adding to the likelihood that the latter is not a complete fabrication. After having been reassured by his spiritual advisor, the prophet Isaiah, that he would eventually prevail, Hezekiah, according to 2 Kings 18, verses 8 to 14, receives another communication from Sennacherib. It comes in the form of a letter, whose message is similar to that delivered earlier by the Rabshakeh. Again, trust in Egypt is discouraged. An emphasis is put on the failure of local gods to save the nations that had formerly found themselves under attack by Assyria. This time, however, the chances that the historical Hezekiah ever received such a message are fairly slim. The Rabshakeh's speech in 2 Kings 18 had mentioned Hamath and Arpad, and also Samaria, as places previously conquered by Assyrian troops. These cities, with their surrounding territories, had indeed been incorporated into the Assyrian Empire during the second half of the 8th century. but the places mentioned in Sennacherib's putative letter are different. They include Gozan, Razanu, Haran, and the Rezev, Rzappa, which had been part of the Assyrian kingdom since much earlier times, and would therefore have been poor precedents for the danger in which Jerusalem found itself in 701. All three of them, however, are known to have been seized in the late 7th century by the Babylonian kings Nabopolassar and Nebuchadnezzar II. And it is tempting to assume that the message in the letter to Hezekiah reflects these later conquests. The composition of the letter episode in 2 Kings 19, 8-14, must accordingly be dated to the 6th century, long after Sennacherib's campaign. It was probably grounded in the preoccupation of later biblical authors with Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian monarch responsible for finally bringing Judah's independence to an end, and sending the Judeans in 597 and 586 BCE to the rivers of Babylon. Toward the end of the account found in 2 Kings 18-19, a miracle occurs. After a series of grim prophecies that Isaiah hurls at Assyria, I will put my hook in your nose and my bit in your mouth. I will turn you back on the way by which you came. The text provides a spectacular and certainly surprising denouement for the story of Sennacherib's Judean campaign. That very night the angel of the Lord set out and struck down 185,000 in the camp of the Assyrians. When morning dawned, they were all dead bodies. Then King Sennacherib left, went home, and lived at Nineveh. What is one to make of this ending, which is clearly at odds with Sennacherib's own account? And what was really the outcome of the Assyrian attack on Judah in 701? Who won and who lost? Could the Bible be wrong? These questions have preoccupied scholars for more than 150 years, prompting very different answers. For the faithful, who believe in the Bible's inerrant nature, the matter is simple. God killed the Assyrian soldiers by means of a miraculous angelic intervention, and thus delivered Hezekiah, a particularly righteous king, from all his troubles. From a historical point of view, such a scenario is, of course, difficult to accept. But quite a few modern scholars have declined to dismiss the biblical account of the outcome of Sennacherib's campaign out of hand. Instead, they have tried to rationalize it by providing a naturalistic explanation for the story of the angel's lethal action. A mode of reasoning much in line with other attempts, often enthusiastically endorsed by popular media, to scientifically vindicate biblical miracle stories. The parting of the Sea of Reeds by Moses, for example, has been explained as the result of a wind set down that pushed away the waters of Lake Taurus in the eastern Nile Delta. In the case of the story of the angel defeating the Assyrians, the proponents of a naturalistic solution have argued that it was the sudden outbreak of an epidemic in the military camp that actually decimated the Assyrian troops. Deadly plagues did occur in Iron Age Western Asia. Assyrian and Babylonian chronicles, as already seen, record epidemics affecting Assyria for the years 802, 765, 759, and 707. Herodotus' story of the field mice might support the epidemic scenario. According to Herodotus, these mice gnawed through the quivers, bows, and shield handles of Sennacherib's army at Pelusium, leading to the defeat of the Assyrians at the hand of Pharaoh Sephos, and to the latter setting up an image of himself in the temple of Hephaestus, the Egyptian god Ptah, with a mouse in his hand. To be sure, it is rats rather than mice that normally spread particularly dangerous infectious diseases, but mice can carry the plague pathogen as well. It is moreover noteworthy that the Greeks considered the god Apollo Smintheus, that is, Apollo of the mice, a deity represented on coins with a mouse in his hands, as bringing about deadly plagues, most famously the one that affected the Achaeans at Troy. Also of interest is that the Bible in Isaiah 38:21 mentions Hezekiah's recovery from a grave illness. Its symptoms included boils, which Isaiah treated with a fig poultice. Neither the exact nature nor the date of Hezekiah's illness, nor its historicity, but it has been suggested, not least because figs are known to have been used against plague swellings, that Hezekiah might have suffered from bubonic plague or some other highly contagious disease, that his illness fell into the time period of Sennacherib's western campaign is at least possible. Especially in view of the Herodotean account, the idea that it was a plague that led to the Assyrian retreat from Jerusalem is certainly intriguing. But it must be admitted that the evidence for it, for the time being, is at best inconclusive. No text that can be reasonably considered a primary source talks explicitly about an epidemic having befallen the Assyrian troops in 701 BCE. Herodotus' story, set in Egypt rather than in Judah, was authored some 250 years after Sennacherib's death. And according to the biblical account, only Hezekiah, and no one else in Jerusalem, was sick. Another explanation for the Assyrian withdrawal from Jerusalem, one grounded in what one might call a feminist perspective, argues that Sennacherib's mother played a major, albeit indirect, role in the events. Advanced by the Assyriologist Stephanie Daly, this theory draws on the discovery, made in 1989 by Iraqi archaeologists at Kala, of the burial chambers of several Neo-Assyrian queens. One chamber held a stone sarcophagus that contained the bodies of two women, identified based on inscriptional evidence as Yarba and Atalia, the main wives of Tiglath-Pileser III and Sargon II respectively. Daly astutely observed that the name Atalia is otherwise known only from the Bible, where it was borne by a daughter of the 9th century Israelite king Ahab and his Phoenician wife Jezebel. Atalia later married into the royal family of Judah and effectively ruled that country for some time. In Daly's opinion, Sargon's wife Atalia was likewise a member of the Judean royal family, and probably the mother of Sennacherib. If this really was the case, Daly reasons, Sennacherib must have felt sympathy with Judah, which might have prevented him from conquering Jerusalem and from replacing the Judean king Hezekiah with another ruler. This stimulating hypothesis is fraught with difficulties too, however. Most importantly, it is now virtually certain that Atalia, while indeed at one point a wife of Sargon II, was actually not Sennacherib's mother. Sennacherib was instead in all likelihood the son of a woman by the name of Raima, and as such probably not particularly infatuated with Atalia, who seems to have been a later spouse of Sargon. It is also not certain that Atalia was indeed of Judean or Israelite extraction, even though the possibility cannot be ruled out. One could try to argue that the biblical story of the Assyrian Rabshakeh speaking Hebrew with the people of Jerusalem somehow backs up the idea of family connections between the Assyrian and Judean royal dynasties. But this would be a very speculative line of reasoning. A third theory regarding the Assyrian retreat from Jerusalem holds that it was the Cushite intervention that forced Sennacherib's troops out of Judah. Proposed in 2002 by Canadian journalist Henry Orban, this thesis is grounded in an Afrocentric approach. The author states explicitly that his work on the Cushites had been inspired by his adopted son of African descent. Though he is not an academic, one would do Orban an injustice to consider his ideas as uninformed or as an exercise in writing marginalized groups back into history at all costs. Orban is familiar with the sources, and he is careful with his conclusions. Rather than claiming that the Black Pharaohs scored a major military victory over Assyrian troops in 701, he suggests that the encounter of the two sides at El Tekka resulted in a stalemate and a negotiated settlement between them. Assyria would not lose all its influence in the region, but would refrain from annexing Judah, while Egypt would gain security and keep its commercial access to the southern Levant. Thanks to the Cushites, though, Jerusalem was saved, and the future emergence of Judaism and Christianity, otherwise inconceivable, thus secured. The debate about Orban's thesis continues among modern scholars. In 2020, the peer-reviewed series Perspectives on Hebrew Scriptures and Its Contexts published a volume with essays by 8 well-established academics who had been charged with re-evaluating Orban's theory. Most of them expressed support for it, albeit with certain reservations. But the only Assyriologist among the authors, Kalos and Younger, abstained from a verdict. All things considered, Younger's polite skepticism seems apt. Orban's thesis is not entirely convincing. It has already been pointed out that after the Battle of Eltekeh, Sennacherib was able to punish the Ekronite rebels who had apparently asked the Kushites for help, and to reinstate the loyal party as Ekron's king. There is no evidence for a negotiated settlement between Assyria and Kush. Philistia remained part of Assyria's imperial periphery in the following years, and nothing indicates that the Kushites had much of a say in the region. The absence of Egyptian sources related to the events of 701 is noteworthy as well. So far, archaeologists have failed to find a single more elaborate historical inscription from the reign of Pharaoh Shebiktu, who ruled Egypt during the events of 701. This is in marked contrast to the many inscriptions left by his predecessors and successors, and thus perhaps not an accident of discovery. Shebiktu may simply not have had much to brag about. All true history is contemporary history. The Italian philosopher and historian Benedetto Croce once famously quipped, "The three aforementioned theories about the reasons for Sennacherib's retreat from Jerusalem, all advanced during the past few decades, exemplify this adage. With their naturalistic, feminist, and identitarian proclivities, they are clearly rooted in intellectual currents of recent times. None of the theories can be proven wrong in every respect. Even though the Assyrians seem to have won the battle with the Kushites at Eltekeh, having to fight it in the first place stretched Assyrian resources, which may have been a factor in Sennacherib's decision not to put Jerusalem to a long siege. Sennacherib's mother was no Judean princess, but there are a few hints pointing to an unusual interest among members of the Assyrian elite in the Hebrew world of Israel and Judah. And while there is no unequivocal evidence for a plague among the Assyrian troops campaigning in 701, it is noteworthy that Sennacherib conducted very few military operations in the following years, which leaves open the possibility that his armies had in fact returned from the west, with a contagious disease in tow. The year 698 was moreover a time of hunger in Assyria, with very high barley prices. But the theories outlined above remain nonetheless highly speculative. The best explanation for Sennacherib's retreat from Jerusalem seems to be a different one. The Assyrian king had probably made a simple cost-benefit analysis when weighing his options. The effort to conquer the heavily fortified city and the possible losses among his soldiers would have been so great that Sennacherib deemed it preferable to leave Hezekiah in office, under the condition that he sent him tribute and become an Assyrian vassal. This would have been very much in line with the grand strategy Sennacherib pursued in general. The concept of grand strategy has been defined by the historian John Lewis Gaddis as the alignment of unlimited aspirations with necessarily limited capabilities. And Sennacherib seems to have believed that the capabilities of the Assyrian state were insufficient to take full control of too many additional polities within its sphere of influence. In contrast to his three predecessors, he showed a strong preference for indirect over direct rule, handing power to client kings rather than creating new provinces. This was Sennacherib's modus operandi not only in Judah but also in Ekron, Ashdod, Ashkelon, and elsewhere. It is possible that Sennacherib's decision to return to the east was hastened by some kind of illness that had befallen some of his soldiers, and perhaps also by intelligence reports about the deteriorating political situation in Babylonia, where the Assyrian military was now needed more urgently. But this is not certain. Hezekiah, for his part, may have been forced to pay a heavy price for staying in power, but had good reasons to accept what Sennacherib required of him. After all, recognizing the Assyrian king as his overlord spared Jerusalem the dire fate that had befallen the city of Lachish, which had been left in ruins. The kingdom of Judah suffered a loss in wealth in the wake of Sennacherib's campaign, and the number of settlements in its countryside shrank. But it remained a formally independent state, and an important hub in the international overland trade for another full century. It seems that for the authors of the biblical account of Sennacherib's campaign, this was enough to describe its outcome as a vindication of Hezekiah's decision, and not as the humiliation that it actually was for the Judean king. As noted earlier, Sennacherib's attack on Judah has been called the first world event, and it is true that there are very few earlier events that implicated such a vast and international cast of characters. In geographic terms, what happened in 701 had global dimensions as well. The capitals of the two most powerful participants, Napata in Kush and Nineveh in Assyria, located on different continents, were some 2,300 kilometers, 1,430 miles away from each other as the crow flies. But Sennacherib's Judean adventure can be considered even more a world event with regard to the place it came to hold in the cultural memory of later times. The stories about it in the Bible, and other early stories now lost, generated a whole archipelago of secondary and tertiary narratives in Hebrew, Aramaic, Egyptian, Greek, Syriac, and Arabic, and from there spread out even further into the literatures of other nations. Some of these later narratives were closely linked to the ones from the Bible, while others were free adaptations. Many have a pronounced anti-imperialist bent. As time went by, Sennacherib, the evil cosmocrator, as he was called in rabbinic traditions, became a cipher for oppressive tyrants and other thoroughly despised people all over the world. The 8th century CE Byzantine Emperor Leo III, notorious for his iconoclastic tendencies, was called a Nestorian, an Amalekite, a chameleon, and Sennacherib by his opponents. An etching by the 16th century German draftsman Hans Lautensack presents the Ottoman siege of Vienna in 1529 as a reenactment of Sennacherib's siege of Jerusalem. And Lord Byron's poem, The Destruction of Sennacherib, with its famous and often parodied first two lines, "The Assyrians came down like the wolf on the fold, and his cohorts were gleaming in purple and gold," was published in the year of Napoleon's defeat at the Battle of Waterloo. Sennacherib himself would probably have been thoroughly surprised if he had known that his third campaign would be so fervently remembered by future generations. To be sure, as his inscriptions reveal, the Assyrian king considered his victory over the Western rebels in 701 an important achievement, but he was much more committed to another political mission, the subjugation and pacification of Babylonia, and the adoption and adaptation of Babylonian culture for a far-reaching reform of Assyrian religion. 9. Sennacherib's Babylonian problem. Assyria's relationship with Babylonia, its southern neighbor, was a special one. As in the case of Rome and Greece, it featured an emerging superpower militarily strong yet culturally immature that became infatuated with a neighboring civilization that was older and more sophisticated but politically fragmented. The superpower adopted many of the intellectual, religious, and artistic traditions of its neighbor, and granted it significant fiscal privileges and the right of local self-government, but expected in return that its overall political hegemony would be accepted. Under ideal circumstances, such an arrangement might work, but being madly in love while at the same time desperately wishing to dominate one's partner can also be a recipe for disaster. The relationship drama between Assyria and Babylonia had many disastrous moments, particularly during the reign of King Sennacherib. For the conqueror of Judah, Babylon became an obsession that drove him to actions unprecedented in the history of the ancient Near East. But Sennacherib's Babylonian problem had a prehistory. Already under his three predecessors, Assyro-Babylonian relations had often been tense. Except for a few years under Tukulti-Ninurta I in the 13th century BCE, Assyria had never been in full control of Babylonia. But in 729 BCE, when Tiglath-Pileser III conquered the city of Babylon, Babylonia finally became an integral part of Assyria's political identity. Right away, Tiglath-Pileser began to call himself, in addition to his Assyrian titles, King of Babylon and King of Sumer and Akkad, the traditional names for Babylonia's southern and northern parts respectively. He thus formed what one could call in constitutional terms a personal union between Assyria and Babylonia. Other places occupied by Assyrian armies, for example Arpad or Damascus, were simply annexed, without the Assyrian monarch taking on the titles of their previous rulers. But Tiglath-Pileser was eager to communicate that Babylon, with its age-old uniform culture and familiar religious institutions, was different. The king's newly acquired royal appellations were not the only indications of Tiglath-Pileser's regard for Babylonian traditions. Prior to his death in 727, he also participated twice in the Babylonian Akitu festival, which was celebrated at the beginning of the year to honor and renew the power of Babylon's patron deity, Marduk. Of course, ruling Babylonia also brought tangible material benefits to Assyria. Despite the fact that the first centuries of the first millennium had been marked by a series of political and economic crises in the Mesopotamian south, the land continued to be more densely populated than the areas farther north. And thanks to its fertile alluvial soil, barley and date harvests remained bountiful. Babylonia's irrigation agriculture was, moreover, less affected by the vagaries of shifting precipitation patterns than Assyrian dry farming. No direct evidence reveals what the Babylonians thought about the putatively benevolent Assyrian occupation of their country that started with Tiglath-Pileser III. But it is clear that many of the citizens of Babylon, or Sipa or Uruk, were not swayed by the relatively privileged treatment they received from their new masters, and were looking for ways to regain their freedom. When the opportunity came, after the death of Tiglath-Pileser's successor, Shalmaneser V, in 722 BCE, Babylonia's political elites formed an alliance with the neighboring kingdom of Elam and threw off the Assyrian yoke. For the following 12 years, the land was ruled by Marduk-aplu-iddina II, a scion of the Chaldean tribe of Bit Yarkin, who sent a lake close to the Persian Gulf. Remarkably enough, none of this seems to have dampened the excitement with which Sargon II, Assyria's new king, continued to view all things Babylonian. Even during the years when Babylonia was independent, Sargon peppered his royal inscriptions with allusions to the Babylonian epic of creation, which the people knew by its first two words, Enuma Elish, or When Above, a text that celebrated the victory of the god Marduk over the forces of chaos. He also never ceased to consider Marduk the ultimate source of authority for the Assyrian god Ashur. In a letter to Ashur from 714 BCE, Sargon claims that he embarked on his brutal attack on the holy city of Musasir in the Zagros Mountains with the great support of Ashur, father of the gods and lord of all the lands, to whom, since distant days, Marduk had granted power over all the other gods of the lowland and mountain regions of the Four Quarters. Small wonder then that when the Assyrians finally reconquered Babylon in 710 and put Marduk-aplu-iddina to flight, Sargon would again participate in the Babylonian Akitu festival. In fact, he stayed in Babylon until 707, leaving the administration of Assyria in the hands of his crown prince, Sennacherib, while granting Babylonia's temple cities tax privileges and freedom from corvée duty. Sargon tried to be as Babylonian as he could, even if this meant that he had to model some of his inscriptions on those of his Babylonian arch-enemy, Marduk-aplu-iddina. Playing on a famous line about Greece and Rome by Horace, one could say that under Sargon, captive Babylonia took captive her savage conqueror. Sargon's son and successor Sennacherib, however, had very different ideas about how best to deal with his southern neighbor. He would try to free Assyria from its Babylonian captivity. When Sennacherib, in the wake of his father's violent death in 705 BCE, ascended the Assyrian throne, history seemed initially to repeat itself. Just as earlier, during the beginning of Sargon's reign, a rebellion now broke out in Babylonia, with the indefatigable Marduk-aplu-iddina reappearing on the scene and renewing his old alliance with Elam. It took Sennacherib several months to react, but eventually he met Marduk-aplu-iddina in a pitched battle at Kish near Babylon and defeated him. The much maligned Chaldean, Assyrian inscriptions compare him to a bat, a pig, a cat, and a mongoose, fled to his homeland in the southern marches, where Assyrian soldiers searched for him in vain. In the meantime, Sennacherib and his victorious troops entered Babylon, Sennacherib's earliest account of the aforementioned events uses several phrases that were culled directly from the inscriptions of his father, and like Sargon, Sennacherib claims to have rushed to Babylon with a radiant face. But this is where the similarities end. While Sargon writes that upon his entrance to the city he grasped the hands of the great Lord Marduk and gave more than 154 talents, 4.6 metric tons or 5 US tons, of gold, on 1,604 talents, nearly 50 metric tons or 55 US tons, of silver to him and other Babylonian deities as gifts. Sennacherib states that he plundered Marduk-Aplu-Adina's royal palace and counted gold, silver, and other precious goods, along with the king's wife, his palace women, eunuchs, singers, and servants, as booty. References to presents for the Babylonian gods are notably absent. It does not take too much imagination to picture the faces of the Babylonians witnessing this behavior. They were undoubtedly much less radiant than that of the king. Sennacherib's attitude toward Babylonia would indeed prove markedly different from his father's. Rather than assuming the kingship of Babylon himself, Sennacherib preferred a more indirect form of rule. After his victory over Marduk-Aplu-Adina, he appointed a man of local stock to govern the city and its hinterland. His choice fell on a certain Bel-Ibni, who came from an old Babylonian family but had grown up in the Assyrian palace like a young puppy. Late in 703 BCE, Bel-Ibni ascended the Babylonian throne. Sennacherib preferred a Babylonia that was compliant to his wishes but formally independent. He pointedly diverged from Sargon, who had claimed that not only Arsha but also the Babylonian gods Marduk and Nabu had bestowed upon him an unrivaled kingship. In Sennacherib's inscriptions, which otherwise use exactly the same language, only Arsha is considered the divine originator of the king's royal status. As the years passed, it became apparent that Bel-Ibni's rule was failing to produce the stability Sennacherib had hoped for, especially in Babylonia's southern parts. Resistance against the Assyrian puppet king never fully stopped. In 700 BCE, the year after Sennacherib's campaign against Judah, the situation had gotten so bad that Assyrian troops were dispatched back to Babylonia, with the mission of neutralizing two of the most dangerous troublemakers. The first was a certain Mushezib-Marduk, a member of the Chaldean Bit-Dakuri tribe, who had served for a few years as a high-ranking officer in the army of Sargon II, but had defected out of fear of some bodily punishment. He had fled to a swampy region on the Persian Gulf, where he and a group of Aramean outlaws had embarked on anti-Assyrian guerrilla warfare. The second was the notorious Marduk-Aplu-Adina, ever ready to bounce back. Both rebels managed to escape to Elam. 8 years later, Mushezib-Marduk would make an impressive comeback from there. But for the time being, the flight of the two insurgents meant that Sennacherib was able to restore a reasonable degree of control over southern Babylonia. To further consolidate his power, he appointed a new king in Babylon. Bel-Ibni was moved out of the way, and Sennacherib's own eldest son, Ashurnasirpal, replaced him. Babylonia remained calm for the next 6 years, giving Sennacherib breathing room to focus on his ambitious building program at home. It was during this time that he transformed Nineveh into Jonah's great city, a metropolis of legendary size and splendor. The few military campaigns undertaken by Assyrian armies in this period, or directed against territories in the north and northwest, were of modest scale. The only one that Sennacherib participated in personally, and attack on settlements in the area of the modern Judidar in eastern Turkey, was little more than an extended mountain hike. But in the spring of 694, the king felt a renewed urge to prove his military mettle. He led his army back to the south to embark on an entirely unprovoked attack on Marduk-Aplu-Adina and his fellow exiles from Bit Yarkin who were living in Elam. Rather than traveling by land, the Assyrians crossed the Persian Gulf on ships manned with Phoenician and Greek sailors to catch the enemy off guard. According to Sennacherib's annals, his naval forces succeeded in conquering the Elamite cities where the Yakinites had found refuge. and brought at least some of them, albeit not Marduk-Apluadina, who might have died in the meantime, back as captives. The sacrifices for the god Ea that Sennacherib, along with a small golden boat, a golden fish, and a golden crab, had cast into the sea prior to the maritime expedition, seemed to have paid off. But after everything had apparently gone quite well, although without really shifting the strategic balance in the region in favor of Assyria, two unexpected and catastrophic incidents occurred, interrelated and with wide-ranging consequences. In the fall of 694, the Elamites, deeply angered by Sennacherib's assault on their territory, raided Babylonia and attacked the Babylonia city of Sippar, and shortly thereafter, the anti-Assyrian faction in Babylon, eager to regain full independence, seized the moment and handed Babylon's puppet king, Ashur-nadin-shumi, to the Elamite invaders. A cuneiform letter written some 20 years later to King Esarhaddon identifies a Babylonia diviner and haruspex by the name of Apliah as the ringleader of the conspiracy, and reveals that its participants had been sworn to secrecy by reciting an oath in the name of the deified heavenly bodies Jupiter and Sirius. In consultation with his Babylonian allies, the Elamite king Halushu-in-Shushanak appointed a citizen of Babylon, Nergal-ushezib of the Gahu family, as the city's new king. Ashur-nadin-shumi paid a high price for his failure to win the hearts and minds of his Babylonian subjects during his tenure as king. He was brought to Elam, where he was, in all likelihood, tortured and then killed. His death was a major turning point. It brought about a dramatic showdown between Sennacherib and his Babylonian enemies. Often, structural factors, be they political, economic, or ecological in nature, can be identified as the driving forces of history. But the events that ensued after the shocking reversal of Assyria's fortunes in Babylonia in 694 seem to have been rooted primarily in the personal emotions of the historical protagonists, most notably Sennacherib himself. The Assyrian king must have been horrified by the terrible fate that, as a result of Babylonian treason and Elamite cruelty, had befallen Ashur-nadin-shumi, his firstborn son. Sennacherib's inability to openly acknowledge what had happened, since it was so much at odds with the image of strength he wished to project, can only have exacerbated the hatred he felt towards those whom he deemed responsible for the disaster. For the following 5 years, Sennacherib pursued almost single-mindedly a mission of revenge against his enemies in the south. The situation in Babylonia was initially highly volatile. Some cities chose to side with Nergal-ushezib, while others remained in the Assyrian camp. Early in 693, Sennacherib, worried that an enemy attack was imminent, evacuated the statue of the patron deity of the city of Dur, strategically located near the Babylonian Elamite border. In the fall, Assyrian soldiers seized additional divine statues in the southern city of Uruk, in an operation more reminiscent of a hostile takeover than a rescue mission. On their way back from Uruk, the Assyrian troops met with a combined Babylonian Elamite army near Nippur, which had only recently been conquered by the new Babylonian king Nergal-ushezib. The Assyrians prevailed and defeated the enemy troops. Retaliating for Ashur-nadin-shumi's murder, Sennacherib's soldiers killed one of the sons of the Elamite king Halushu-in-Shushanak. Nergal-ushezib, who had fallen from his horse in mid-battle, was captured and brought to Nineveh. The fate that awaited him there was grim. Sennacherib put him on display at the gate leading to the citadel, chained up together with a wild bear that would slowly devour him. It was one of those gruesome spectacles that were held on a regular basis to provide entertainment for the citizens of the Assyrian capital. Yet if Sennacherib believed all this would tip the balance decisively in his favor, he was sadly mistaken. Even though one of the king's main adversaries had been eliminated, the Assyrian victory at Nippur did not restore Assyrian hegemony over Babylonia. It led, however, to an internal revolt against Halushu-in-Shushanak. The ensuing chaos in Elam prompted Sennacherib to embark on a direct attack on that land. In the winter of 693-692, outside the usual season for military campaigns, the king directed his army southeast, toward Elamite territory. A great many small hamlets in the border region with Elam were conquered and looted. But when the Assyrian troops moved on toward Madaktu, where the Elamite king had his main residence, they encountered a major problem. As Sennacherib himself put it with remarkable openness, in the month of Tebatu, bitter cold set in and continuous rain fell, and then wind, rain, and snow came in equal force. I was afraid of the gorges, the outflows of the mountains, so I turned around and took the road to Assyria. And thus the expedition against Elam ended with a whimper rather than a bang. In the meantime, a new king had been installed in Babylon. It was Mushezib-Marduk, the recalcitrant Chaldean adventurer and anti-Assyrian warrior who had fled to Elam in 700 BCE. As someone who had close relations with Elamites, Arameans, and other Chaldeans, and inside knowledge about the Assyrian military from his short stint in the Assyrian army, he seemed the right man to bring together and lead a broad coalition of all those eager to fight Assyria's ever-growing imperial ambitions. For the first time in ages, Assyria's enemies were suddenly back on the offensive. The Babylonian elites had paid the new Elamite king, Hunban-Menanu, significant amounts of gold, silver, and precious stones from the treasury of the Temple of Marduk to secure his continued support. Hunban-Menanu, in turn, had found additional allies among his Iranian neighbors. In 691 BCE, a massive army that included Elamites, Babylonians, Persians, and military forces from many other lands and tribal groups moved northward along the Tigris, in what seems to have been an attempt to enter the Assyrian heartland and fight Sennacherib on his own turf. But the coalition troops never reached this destination. An Assyrian army led by Sennacherib himself was waiting for them at Halule, near modern Samarra, to block their advance. Sennacherib's account of the Battle of Halule is a beautifully crafted celebration of extreme bloodthirstiness in war, written with passion and in an elevated style, replete with allusions to the Babylonian epic of creation and other literary texts. It presents the fight as a reenactment of the cosmic battles waged in primordial times by the gods against the forces of evil. When the hostilities began, Sennacherib claims, he raged like a lion, roared like a storm, and thundered like the weather god Adad. Later, Elamite magnates were slaughtered like fattened bulls restrained with fetters, their throats slit like those of sheep, and their blood flowing like a flood in full spate after a rainstorm in spring. A son of Marduk Aplu-Adina was captured alive in the thick of battle. The horses that had drawn the enemy chariots but had been freed when their drivers had been killed, galloping about on their own, were caught and counted as booty. When their defeat became obvious, the two leaders of the allied enemy troops, Hunban-Menanu and Mushezib-Marduk, escaped under humiliating circumstances. With their hearts throbbing like those of pursued young pigeons, as Sennacherib put it, they trampled the corpses of their fallen soldiers as they pushed on, releasing their excrements inside their chariots. The vulgar humor of this last episode stands in marked contrast to the lofty style in which it is told. To what extent Sennacherib's account of the Battle of Halule is fiction rather than fact is not easy to determine. A terse entry in the Babylonian Chronicle claims that the melee resulted in an Assyrian retreat, a statement hard to reconcile with Sennacherib's panegyrical description of the events. It would be wrong, however, to dismiss Sennacherib's version out of hand as a counterfactual propaganda piece. An inscription from Nineveh reports that the Assyrians seized several enemy chariots, including those of the Elamite and Babylonian kings, after the battle and brought them to Sennacherib's new arsenal at Nineveh. It stands to reason that the royal excrements that Sennacherib's ghost riders described with so much glee were not a product of their imagination. They had probably been found on the chariot's floorboards by Assyrian soldiers removing enemy equipment from the battlefield. In all likelihood, The actual outcome of the Battle of Halule was a temporary stalemate. The Elamite and Babylonian troops had to abandon their offensive and march back home. But the Assyrians were unable to seize the moment and follow them in hot pursuit. Their return to the south, however, was only a matter of time. Sennacherib was regrouping his forces. In fact, his account of the Halule episode, with its allusions to mythological battles of yore and its tendency to highlight the archetypal wickedness of the Babylonians, those evil demons, was probably aimed at paving the way ideologically for the next step the king had in mind: Babylon's complete annihilation. Sennacherib wasted no time. By the summer of the following year, 690, Assyrian troops had gathered at Babylon to lay siege to the city. Babylon's alliance with Elam had been shattered, and the Elamite king, Umbambenarnu, would soon be seized by a stroke that would leave him unable to speak for the rest of his life. An Assyrian attack on Dermatu in the Wadi Sirhan in northern Arabia thwarted any possible attempts by Arab tribes to come to Mushazib-Marduk's assistance. Aware that the fate Sennacherib had in store for them would be fearsome, the people of Babylon resisted for 15 months, under conditions described in a legal document from nearby Dilbat as extremely dire. Barley was being sold for more than 50 times the average price. In the reign of Mushazib-Marduk, there was siege, famine, hunger, starvation, and hard times in the land. Everything had become non-existent. For 1 shekel, 8.5 grams or 0.3 ounces of silver, one could buy no more than 2 liters or 2 quarts of barley. The city gates were locked and there was no exit in all 4 directions. The corpses of the people filled the squares of Babylon because there was no one to bury them. In the late fall of 689, the Assyrians finally took the city. Mushazib-Marduk and his family were carried off alive, apparently after having been betrayed by a local citizen eager to reap the generous reward, his own weight in silver, that was offered for the rebel king's capture. We know about this last detail from a letter from the reign of Ashurnasirpal, in which Sennacherib's grandson announces an even more generous reward for the arrest of another Babylonian rebel. Just as my father, Sennacherib, on account of Shurzubu, i.e. Mushazib-Marduk, placed Ardad-Barak on scales and weighed out and gave him his weight in silver, so I will now place on scales whoever takes him, the new rebel, prisoner, even if he should kill him, and weigh out and give him his weight in gold. What happened next in Babylon was an unprecedented orgy of destruction. Sennacherib later boasted of the carnage. Babylon's people Yainod I did not spare. I filled the city squares with their corpses. I handed the property of that city over to my people, and they kept it for themselves. My people seized and smashed the gods dwelling in its midst. I destroyed, devastated, and burned the city and its buildings. I removed bricks and earth from the inner and outer wall, the temples and the ziggurat, and threw them into the Aratu River. I dug canals into the center of the city, inflicting destruction worse than what the deluge had wrought, so that in the future the site of that city and its temples will no longer be recognized. I dissolved it in water and annihilated it, making it like a meadow. Even if the acts of violence outlined in this passage had been inflicted on some faraway city in the Levant or the Zagros Mountains, they would have been deemed extraordinary in their severity. But they were directed against Babylon, navel of the Mesopotamian world, fountainhead of cuneiform learning, and religious center par excellence, must have made them utterly incomprehensible to many contemporary observers. To be sure, Sennacherib's description exaggerates the damage suffered by the city. Babylon was not washed away by some artificially created deluge, with the debris, as Sennacherib claims, carried by the Euphrates as far as Dilmun, modern Bahrain, in the Persian Gulf. But the destruction archaeologists have observed in Babylon's Merkez quarter, the limited number of Babylonian economic documents from the years after 689, and references in the Babylonian Chronicle to the cessation of the Akitu festival during Sennacherib's remaining years and into the reign of his successor, Esarhaddon, suggest that his account is also not completely misleading. after a decade and a half of unforgivable betrayals, bloody battles, extended sieges, and painful population transfers, Babylonia was finally quiet. What it experienced, though, was not the kind of tranquility that Pax Assyrica had brought to other parts of the empire. It was the peace of the graveyard. Sennacherib's goal had been to eradicate Babylon from the political and mental map of the world, and he seemed to have achieved it at last. But had he really? Physically large parts of the city of Babylon, especially its temples and palaces, were indeed obliterated after the Assyrian attack of 689. But as an idea, a lieu de mémoire, Babylon lived on. The city continued to loom large in the imaginations of the Mesopotamian people, so large in fact that Sennacherib's court intellectuals had to find ways to cope with the widespread phantom pain caused by the loss of its renowned sanctuaries and much-attended festivals. One way for them to do so was to denigrate and mock Babylonia's age-old traditions, which until recently the Assyrian kings themselves had so enthusiastically endorsed. The best example of this approach, which also helped suppress any guilt the perpetrators of the destruction might have felt, is the Marduk ordeal text, known from clay tablets found at Nineveh, Ashurnasirpal. The cuneiform text, written in Assyrian, has the format of a cultic commentary, a genre that provides learned explanations of the ceremonies performed during temple rituals, often by linking them to mythological stories about the gods for whom the rituals were carried out. The Marduk ordeal text seems to comment on several different Babylonian rituals, but its main focus is Babylon's famous Akitu festival, which had traditionally been celebrated over the first 11 days of the month of Nisanu at the beginning of the new year. Highlights of the festival included a blessing of Marduk's Isagil temple and a recitation of the Babylonian Epic of Creation, or Enuma Elish. The arrival of Marduk's divine son Narbu from the city of Borsippa on day 5, a divine assembly reenacted with the help of statues at the Dais of Destinies, where Marduk decreed the fates for the new year and the subsequent procession of the gods to the so-called Akitu house outside Babylon, all on day 9. Feasting and gift-giving in the Akitu house on day 10, and yet another assembly to decree the fates, plus the return of the gods to their main temples on day 11. The objective of the Akitu festival was to emphasize the greatness of Babylon's chief deity, Marduk, and his divine retinue, but the Marduk ordeal text presents a very different picture of the cultic acts and paraphernalia associated with the festival. It reinterprets them as symbolic correlates of a trial, an ordeal of Marduk, held against him at the Akitu house, on behalf of Ashur, and leading to his criminal conviction. The text states, for example, the cloth beneath him, i.e. Marduk, and the red wool with which he is clothed, are the blows with which he was struck. They are dyed with his blood. Red was the color of vigor and power in Mesopotamian religion, and this was why Marduk, represented by his statue, was wearing red garments when making public appearances. But the Marduk ordeal text undermines this conventional understanding, claiming that the color actually stood for the wounds the god had received when he was taken prisoner. Even more blatantly revisionist is the text's assertion that the Enuma Elish, the heroic epic recited during the Akitu festival, rather than celebrating Marduk's rise to absolute power, concerns his imprisonment. Celtic commentaries were often considered secret knowledge in ancient Mesopotamia, not to be disseminated beyond the narrow circle of the religious cognoscenti, but the Marduk ordeal text ends with a curse against anyone who reads this tablet and does not disclose its content to those who do not know it. In other words, the text was an anti-Babylonian propaganda treatise meant for wide distribution, especially in Assyria. At some point it must have become clear that ridiculing Babylon's festivals and cults would not be enough to overcome the profound psychological reverberations of Assyria's attack on the city. The void left by the events of 689 was simply too great. Sennacherib must have felt it himself, as the many allusions to the Enuma Elish in his account of the Battle of Helule demonstrate, The king was obsessed with Babylon's religious traditions. But how to preserve a legacy that extolled the power of one's archenemy? The solution that Sennacherib and his inner circle found was to engage in a brazen act of cultural cannibalism. Key elements of Babylon's religious infrastructure were transferred to Assyria and repurposed for the greater glory of the Assyrian Empire. This happened quite literally with the lavishly adorned cultic bed of Marduk, on which the god used to spend quality time with his wife Sapanitu, and with a throne of his. Both had originally stood in the Kella, the inner chamber of Marduk-Esagil's temple, or in the Keller of the small temple of Marduk on top of Babylon's ziggurat, the famous Tower of Babel. Assyrian troops removed them from Babylon and brought them to Ashur, where Sennacherib rededicated them to the god Ashur. Henceforth, it would be Ashur and his wife Mulissu who would find pleasure and rest on the divine furniture, rather than Marduk and his spouse. In 655 BCE, Sennacherib's grandson Ashurnasirpal returned the bed and the throne to Babylon, where they were again to serve Marduk. But before he did so, his scribes copied on a clay tablet the inscription that Sennacherib's scribes had written on the two objects after they had arrived in Ashur. This inscription is of considerable interest. Replacing Marduk as the dedicatee, it is directed to Ashur, the king of the gods, the father of the gods, the one who decrees the fates, who brings devastation like the deluge to the land that has been treacherous and evil, and who makes a destructive flood sweep over all those places in the four corners of the world that do not submit to his governor, i.e. Sennacherib. Sennacherib, in other words, claims to have acted on behalf of Ashur when attacking Babylon, an event indirectly referenced by the remark about the devastating flood that had ravaged an evil land. At the same time, by calling Ashur the one who decrees the fates, the inscription ascribes to the god a prerogative previously held by Marduk, and makes him, somewhat paradoxically, more Babylonian than ever before. This Babylonianization of Assyrian religion also took place on a much larger scale. During the 680s, the whole Celtic infrastructure of Ashur was transformed after the model of Babylon. The old entrance to the Keller of the Ashur temple was closed and replaced by a new one, which faced a new eastern courtyard apparently replicating the eastern court of Marduk-Esagil's temple. Inside this courtyard, workmen erected a Babylonian-style, altar-like dais of destinies, which could be used for a divine ceremony in the course of which Ashur, rather than Marduk, would decree the fates. An inscription on that dais or on a ceremonial tablet of destinies placed on it asked that Ashur look after the reign of Sennacherib, king of Assyria, determine a good destiny, a destiny of good health for him, and grant him political preeminence. The clay tablet on which these lines were copied is written in Babylonian script, suggesting that the religious reforms that Sennacherib put in place relied in part on the know-how of Babylonian priests who had been brought to Assyria. But the most obvious example of Sennacherib's attempt to recreate Babylon's sacred landscape at Ashur was the new Akitu house that he built in the 680s outside the western wall of the city. Modeled after the Akitu house north of Babylon and erected on massive foundations, it had a sumptuous, well-irrigated orchard around it and must have looked quite stunning. Its construction had started after the gods had given their consent by means of divination, and after Sennacherib had abandoned an earlier plan to build an Akitu house at Nineveh. An inscription mentions that inside the new sanctuary, Sennacherib heaped up earth taken from the ruins of Babylon, a grim memento of the building's origins in the Babylonian idea. The ceremonial Sumerian name that Sennacherib gave the new Akitu house in Ashur was Eabauga, the house where the sea is put to death. The sea to which this name alludes was the primeval proto-goddess Tiamat, who embodied the deep ocean, Babylonian Tamtu. Tiamat was the main opponent of Marduk in the Babylonian epic of creation, the Enuma Elish. The epic played an enormously important role in first millennium Mesopotamia, but only in the cult, especially in the Akitu festival, but also in school and as a cultural text. Kings such as Sargon II and Sennacherib quoted it in their royal inscriptions. It starts with Tiamat and her partner Apsu, a male deity associated with fresh water, bringing forth at the beginning of time several generations of younger gods. The noise these young gods make annoys their progenitors, and Apsu decides to kill them. But Ea, one of the younger gods, defeats him and founds his abode within the waters of the slain god, where he engenders a son, Marduk. Soon, it becomes clear that the conflict with Apsu has only been the prelude to a much greater fight. This time it is Tiamat who becomes fed up with the disturbances of the younger gods and wants to get rid of them. In a cataclysmic battle, Marduk vanquishes her, splits her in two, and uses the two halves of her watery corpse to form heaven and earth. He fashions the celestial bodies and crowns his great work with the creation of mankind. As a reward for his heroic achievements, and for having brought an end to primeval chaos and matriarchal misrule, the other gods make Marduk their king and build a dwelling place for him, the Esagil Temple in Babylon. It becomes the navel of the world and the central gathering place of the gods. The doctrine of absolute power laid out in Enuma Elish mirrored perfectly the imperial ambitions of the Assyrian kings. Small wonder then that the text had such tremendous appeal for them. There was only one problem. The god celebrated in the epic was Marduk and not the Assyrian state god Ashur, and the city whose greatness the text praised was Babylon. The solution that Sennacherib's literati found to deal with this dilemma after Babylon's destruction in 689 was a simple one. They created a new edition of Enuma Elish that rectified the aforementioned deficiencies. This did not require too many changes, and it was by and large enough to replace the name of Marduk with that of Ashur the god, and the name of Babylon with that of Ashur the city. Henceforth it was no longer Marduk who had killed Tiamat and been exalted as the king of the gods, but Ashur, whose city became the new center of the cosmos. Fragments of clay tablets inscribed with the Assyrian version of the epic have been found at Nineveh and Ashur, indicating that the text was widely distributed. As its name makes abundantly clear, Sennacherib's new Akitu house in Ashur was conceived to remember and celebrate Ashur's victory over Tiamat, as it was recounted in the new Enuma Elish. This happened in the course of an elaborate spring festival at the beginning of the year, when, in an attempt to refashion in Assyrian style Marduk's Akitu procession in Babylon, Sennacherib had statues representing Ashur, his family, and his divine retinue, paraded along a new procession street from the Ashur temple in the east of the city to the Akitu house. Once there, Ashur's triumph over the forces of chaos was ritually reenacted, though how exactly the reenactment played out remains unknown. The decoration of the Akitu house featured Sennacherib's new Ashur theology as well. Except for its foundations, little is preserved of the building, but a clay tablet describes scenes depicted on a bronze gate leading into the sanctuary. They showed Ashur with his bow as he carries it in the chariot that he rides, the deluge, a type of weapon that he has harnessed, the god Amuru as the driver who rides with him, all the gods who go in front of him and go behind him, those who ride in vehicles and those who go on foot, and the sea monster Tiamat with some terrifying primeval creatures inside her, against whom Ashur, the king of gods, goes to fight. The text goes on to proudly emphasize that Sennacherib had invented new bronze casting techniques to fashion the undoubtedly monumental gate of the new Akitu house. The king, in other words, presents himself as a kind of master engineer, as he also did in some other contexts, for example when claiming that he developed new devices for lifting water. As with his engineering projects, there is something mechanical about the copy-and-paste approach Sennacherib employed in replicating Babylon's Celtic landscape in Ashur and transforming the Babylonian Enuma Elish into an Assyrian text. At the same time, Sennacherib's reform represents a truly remarkable milestone in the history of religion, similar to the more famous religious revolution brought about in the 14th century by Egypt's heretic pharaoh Akhenaten. Both ventures were bold and brutal, were aborted and repressed soon after they had been initiated, and were yet of great consequence. They both had important political repercussions. But there are also some significant differences between them. Up to 700 BCE, Ashur was a deity mostly defined by his civic and political dimensions. He represented the city of Ashur and the Assyrian state. Sennacherib's reform provided him with additional facets of a mythological and cosmological nature. As an inscription written in Sennacherib's name on a kettle drum puts it, Ashur was now the one who formed the cover of the heavens and the netherworld, who dwells in the bright firmament, and who dwells in his temple Ishara, which is in Ashur. The objective of Akhenaten's reform was almost the opposite. The Egyptian pharaoh sought to deprive the sun god of the mythological and Celtic dimensions he had previously possessed, and to reduce him to his cosmological function as the life-giving sun disk, a far more negative theology than the one Sennacherib had in mind for Ashur. Even though certain features of Sennacherib's religious reform remained in place until the very end of Assyrian statehood, its main ideas were soon abandoned. Sennacherib's son and successor Esarhaddon decided to put Babylon back on the map by rebuilding it, and to endorse a political theology that was based on the idea of a balance of power between Ashur and Marduk. Sennacherib's end was a sad one. In 681 BCE, 8 years after his assault on Babylon, he was brutally assassinated. That the king's murder was in some way related to his Babylonian politics is a distinct possibility. Sennacherib's unprecedented actions against Babylon and disagreements about the future direction of Assyria's approach toward its southern neighbor must have led to serious conflicts among the members of the king's inner circle, and some of them probably hated their royal master. But the main reason for Sennacherib's death was a different one: a violent dispute among his sons about who was to succeed the king. For several years, Sennacherib's crown prince was a certain Urdu-Mulisu, who may have been selected by his father as early as 700 BCE. Since Assyrian crown princes had a large staff, including military personnel, Urdu-Mulisu must have been very powerful. He was also enormously affluent. A substantial dossier of economic documents indicates that his third man, the shield-bearer on his chariot, owned large tracts of lands and numerous slaves, almost certainly by virtue of being a close associate of the crown prince. But sometime around 683, under circumstances that are not quite clear, Urdu-Mulisu was abruptly removed from his position as heir to the throne, and replaced by one of Sennacherib's younger sons, a man by the name of Esarhaddon. Torn by jealousy and hatred, and unperturbed by the oaths they had been forced to swear on behalf of the new heir to the throne, Esarhaddon's elder half-brothers, most notably Urdu-Mulisu, began to conspire against the new crown prince and forced him into exile in a western land. Yet despite the pressure he faced, Sennacherib refused to reinstate Urdu-Mulisu or nominate another crown prince. This sealed his fate. A variety of sources reveal that in the winter month of Tebetu, in 681, Urdu-Mulisu killed his father, or had him killed by a proxy, possibly while Sennacherib was visiting a shrine of the god Nusku in the temple of the moon god at Nineveh. The prince probably had accomplices. The Bible mentions that a second son of Sennacherib, Shadazah, Assyrian Sharu-Usar, was likewise involved in the assassination. The plot had nearly been uncovered before it could be carried out. 3 Babylonian goldsmiths residing in Nineveh, all brothers, had heard of Urdu-Mulisu's nefarious plans, and one of them tried to warn Sennacherib, but he never managed to get through to him. When requesting an audience with the king, 2 court officials asked him what he was calling about. The Babylonian informer answered that he wanted to talk about Urdu-Mulisu, whereupon the officials covered his face and pretended they would lead him before the king. Assuming he was speaking to Sennacherib, the informer divulged that Urdu-Mulisu was about to assassinate the monarch. Only when his face was uncovered did he realize that the officials had actually brought him not to the king, but to the ringleader of the conspiracy, Urdu-Malisu himself. Urdu-Malisu interrogated the would-be informer, and then he probably had all three of the goldsmiths killed. After Sennacherib's murder, some of the regicides turned on each other. The exiled Esarhaddon, realizing that the chaos at home gave him a chance to regain power, decided to march back to Assyria. He assembled a small army and crossed eagle-like and unafraid of the snow and cold brought by the month of Shabbatu, the 11th, the western land of Hanagalbat. According to one of Esarhaddon's inscriptions, the crack troops sent by the rebel brothers to block his advance became like crazed women and changed sides. The brothers themselves, panicking in the face of Esarhaddon's imminent arrival, fled to the north. And on the 8th day of the month of Adaru, the 12th, Esarhaddon joyfully entered Nineveh and sat on his father's throne. The south wind, the breeze of the god Ea, was blowing, and favorable sign was seen all over heaven and earth. Sennacherib's decision to nominate a younger son as crown prince, the root cause of all this family strife, had probably been prompted by his close relationship with a woman, his wife Nakia, Esarhaddon's mother. Urdu-Malisu and the other elder half-brothers of Esarhaddon had been children of a different royal wife, who had apparently fallen out of favor at some point. Having the ear of the king almost entirely to herself, Nakia cannot have failed to advance her son's interests. After Esarhaddon ascended the throne, she continued to help him navigate the political landscape. While perhaps the most powerful at that time, Nakia was clearly not the only Assyrian royal woman to wield a great deal of authority. A few others influenced the fate of the Neo-Assyrian kingdom as well, including its relations with Babylonia. In fact, as time went by, royal women seem to have played an ever-increasing role in Assyrian imperial politics. To draw on a statement by Aristotle, women may not have ruled Assyria, but it seems as though more than one of Assyria's rulers was ruled by women. It is worth taking a closer look at them. 10. Mother knows best. The Assyrian succession crisis of the late 680s was a dramatic experience for Nakia, perhaps the most dramatic in her long and extraordinary life. After Urdu-Malisu and his supporters had forced her son Esarhaddon into exile, her position at the Nineveh court had become highly precarious. Fearing for her safety, she must have been worried and anxious. In this defining moment, when everything seemed to be on the line, Nakia prayed to the goddess Ishtar and received an answer. A prophetess from Arbela by the name of Ahad Abisha fell into a frenzy and spoke to Nakia in the name of the goddess. Because you implored me, saying you have placed the ones at the king's right and left side in your lap, but made my own offspring roam the steppe. Now fear not, O king. The kingdom is yours. Yours is the power. The prophecy is known from a clay tablet that also records similar divine messages direct to Esarhaddon. In fact, the Nakia prophecy includes at the end encouraging words addressed to the son rather than the mother. The two clearly had a very close relationship, and it is obvious that Nakia had been enormously eager to help her son ascend the Assyrian throne. Fortunately for her, Ishtar had not promised them too much. After his return to Nineveh, Esarhaddon assumed power, and Nakia saw herself elevated to the position of Queen Mother. Soon she began to play a central role in the affairs of the Assyrian state. It was a remarkable rise for Nakia. When she was young, she had few reasons to expect that she would one day become the most powerful woman, and perhaps for a while the most powerful individual in the Assyrian Empire. Her origins are shrouded in darkness. Because Nakia, the Pure One, is a West Semitic name, and because her son found refuge somewhere in the West during his time in exile, it has been suggested, even though there is no final proof, But Nakia hailed from the region west of Assyria's core area, perhaps from the city of Haran. Presumably Nakia was betrothed to Sennacherib while the latter served as Sargon II's crown prince, and gave birth to Esarhaddon at some point between 715 and 710 BCE. But she was neither the only wife of Sennacherib at this time nor his first. Similar to Assyrian kings, Assyrian crown princes apparently had the right to have sexual relations with multiple women, and Nakia initially played second fiddle at birth. Sennacherib's first wife, and the mother of his older children, including Urdu-Mulisu, was in all likelihood a woman by the name of Tashmet-Usharat. What is known for sure is that Tashmet-Usharat served as Assyria's official queen a few years into Sennacherib's reign, and the king was so fond of her that he supplied her with lavishly equipped lodgings in the royal palaces of Nineveh and Arshur. In an unusually intimate inscription found on a pair of stone sphinxes in the entryway to her private quarters in the southwest palace at Nineveh, Sennacherib romanticized Tashmet-Usharat as "my beloved spouse," whose features the birth goddess Belit-Ili has made more perfect than that of all other women, and describes her residence as a place of love-making, happiness, and exaltation. The text, which dates to about 695 BCE, ends with the only instance in the large corpus of Assyrian royal inscriptions where the royal I becomes a we. May we both live long in these palatial halls, be satisfied with our prosperity, and be in good health and full of joy. But Sennacherib's hopes that the undiluted happiness he enjoyed with Tashmet-Usharat would last forever would be dashed. Tashmet-Usharat either died or, a more probable scenario, was increasingly sidelined by Nakia, without falling out of favor entirely. As a rule, Assyrian kings had only one official queen at a time, but it may be that for parts of the 680s Sennacherib allowed both Tashmet-Usharat and Nakia to hold that position. During these years, the Assyrian state god Ashur became associated with two wives as well, the goddesses Mulisu and Shirua, a bigamist arrangement that may have reflected Sennacherib's relationship status at the time. Tellingly, there was apparently some competition between the two goddesses. A ritual text composed under Sennacherib describes in considerable detail exactly how some altars of Ashur, Mulisu, and Shirua were to be placed next to one another. Toward the end of his reign, Sennacherib may have been deeply involved with yet another woman. A letter sent from Ashur seems to indicate that the king had begun a relationship with the wife of the governor of Ashur, and had ordered that she stay in the royal palace, an episode that brings to mind the biblical story of King David's infatuation with Bathsheba, the wife of the elite warrior Uriah. After Sennacherib's death, the governor took the woman back, and celebrated the king's passing by dressing his staff in festive robes and listening to joyful music, which prompted the anonymous letter writer who was appalled by this behavior to inform on him. Sennacherib may not have been a feminist, as one scholar half-jokingly once suggested, but he seems to have been an Alma Ferrum who attached great importance to his relationships with women. And while the majority of the female members of his royal court remained very much in the shadows, a few of them, most notably Nakia, got used to exerting more and more power. Whatever exactly happened between Sennacherib and his wives and consorts, Nakia's beloved son Esarhaddon did eventually become crown prince, and after many trials and tribulations, also Assyrian king. Overwhelmed by the responsibilities he now had to shoulder, and repeatedly stricken by sickness and depression, he began to rely extensively on the manifold skills of his mother. The written documentation on Nakia's activities during Esarhaddon's reign presents quite an astounding picture. For starters, she is the only Assyrian queen of all times to have ever left a building inscription in royal style. It records, even more remarkably, how Nakia constructed a palace for her son, after the great gods of Assyria and Babylonia had gladly placed him on the throne of his father. As Nakia writes, Esarhaddon gave to me as my lordly share people from foreign lands, enemies conquered with the help of his bow, and I had them carry home baskets so they would make bricks. The new palace was located on the citadel of Nineveh, the very center of Assyrian royal power, and stood in close proximity to the temple of the moon and sun gods, conceivably the place where Sennacherib had been murdered a few years earlier. When the building work was completed, Nicaea claims, she invited the gods along with Esarhaddon himself into the palace for a lavish inauguration party. Nicaea was able to pay for this construction project because she was fabulously rich. In her capacity as Queen Mother, she received a share of the tribute regularly delivered to the Assyrian court, and owned large agricultural estates in various corners of the empire. She had residences in all the major cities of Assyria, and a large staff that included not only high-ranking administrators, but also military personnel. Several inscriptions reveal that Nicaea dedicated valuable objects, including a golden breastplate inlaid with precious stones, to the divine Lady of Nineveh, that is, Ashur's wife, Mulisu, and the divine Lady of Babylon. The gift to the Babylonian deity is, incidentally, a clear indication that Nicaea fully endorsed Esarhaddon's decision to reverse Sennacherib's anti-Babylonian policy. There is other evidence that supports that fact. Indeed, Nicaea may have been the driving force behind the new approach. In various places, images of Nicaea were put on display, a fragmentary bronze relief, probably from the facing of the base of a throne or altar, depicts her standing behind the king with a mirror in her hand, carrying out a religious ritual, and a cuneiform letter sent to Esarhaddon by a functionary of the Temple of Narbu in Kala mentions statues of the king and the statue of the Queen Mother, for which an administrator had failed to procure gold deposited in a royal storehouse. Fashioning monumental images depicting an Assyrian queen or Queen Mother was something entirely new. No such images are known from the time before Esarhaddon. The enormous respect that Nicaea commanded can be gauged from a number of letters from the Assyrian state archives in Nineveh. One of them, sent to Esarhaddon in 670 by his chief exorcist, Marduk-Shar-Kinshumi, assures the king that Nicaea had recovered from a severe illness, and then concludes, "The mother of the king is as capable as the mythological sage Adapar." The only other person ever compared to this antediluvian paragon of wisdom was the Assyrian king himself. Several letters written by priests and high officials were addressed to the Queen Mother herself. Most of them cover donations to various temples or religious festivals, or the performance of apotropaic rituals, that is, rituals meant to repel evil, after a lunar eclipse, all matters that may have been part of the traditional portfolio of high-ranking Assyrian royal women. But there are also letters that deal with political and military affairs. One was sent to Nicaea in the early 670s by the governor of the Sealand, a region near the Persian Gulf. It informs her about an Elamite raid on southern Babylonia. To the mother of the king, my lord, your servant, Nayed Marduk. Good health to the mother of the king, my lord. After the Elamites had marched against us and taken control of a bridge, I wrote, as soon as they came, to the mother of the king, my lord. Now they have dismantled the bridge. We do not know if they will go on. If they do, I shall write to the mother of the king, my lord, again. The forces must reach us, my lord. The letter demonstrates unequivocally the scale of Nicaea's direct involvement in matters of major strategic significance. Revealingly, the sender addresses her at the end as my lord rather than my lady. Nicaea, it seems, did not just act on behalf of the king. She was very much like a king herself. Nicaea was not the only ancient Near Eastern royal woman who became extremely powerful during her life. The Egyptian queens, Hatshepsut and Cleopatra, as sole rulers of their kingdom, and the Hittite queen, Puruhepa, did so too, as did some other female members of the Assyrian royal family. In general, though, female agency in the political sphere was quite limited in the patriarchal societies of the ancient world, and the rise of women to positions of political authority exceptional. The Assyrian king list, which is called a king list for a reason, does not include any women among the more than 100 Assyrian rulers it names. While average Assyrian citizens usually lived in monogamous relationships, Neo-Assyrian kings often had hundreds, if not thousands, of female companions. Most of them spent their time shut away from the world in the constrained quarters of the various harems kept by Assyrian monarchs. It has been estimated that royal palaces in no fewer than 22 Assyrian cities included such harem quarters. Many of the Assyrian harem women must have been royal concubines chosen for their beauty. But the harem populations also included members of the harems of the king's predecessor, female relatives of the monarch, the daughters, sisters, and nieces of vassal kings and political allies, and relocated harem women of defeated enemies. All of them were called sekretu, that is, sequestered women, a title semantically close to harem, the Arabic word for harem woman. Neo-Assyrian sources have little to say about how these women actually lived, but based on evidence from the 2nd millennium BCE, it seems likely that many of them were singers or musicians, and that eunuch guards made sure they did not leave their lodgings without some very good reason. Female chief administrators with the title Shrekintu were responsible for the management of these sprawling communities of women. Legal documents reveal that the Shrekintus bought slaves and land, made loans, and helped organize the production of textiles, an activity in which many harem women were engaged. The staff of the Shrekintus included female scribes writing in Aramaic. Many Assyrian royal women came from outside the Assyrian core area. It seems the Assyrian kings often preferred women from the culturally more advanced regions in the Levant and southwestern Anatolia to women from the east and northeast. Ashurnasirpal, the Assyrian king later charged by the Greeks with having spent far too much of his life among his women, claims in one of his inscriptions that the rulers of Tyre and Arwad in Phoenicia and of Tarbal and Cilicia in Anatolia had all brought him their daughters, their own offspring, together with large dowries, so they could serve as female stewards. While their presence at the Assyrian royal court must have helped improve diplomatic relations with their home countries, the fact that these high-ranking women were put to work in Assyria shows that those kingdoms were not considered equal partners, but inferior vassal states. The accumulation and sequestration of women and their sexual exploitation by the elites and other citizens may have been an essential reason for ancient empires to exist in the first place. The Greek story of Zeus's abduction of the Phoenician princess Europa in the form of a bull is a mythologized expression of this underexplored aspect of pre-modern imperialism. Assyria makes for a good case study, like the gold and silver, the textiles and the timber, the foreign craftsmen and soldiers transferred to the Assyrian capitals, the countless women from all over the known world who were placed at the disposal of Assyrian men, embodied Assyria's power, improved the empire's fitness, and helped secure its future. This is particularly true for the hundreds of women sent over time to Assyria's imperial rulers. In a civilization where infant mortality was high, having a large harem raised the chances of reproductive success for the Assyrian kings, with important political implications, as a steady stream of royal sons guaranteed the continuation of the royal line. In this regard, Assyria was different from imperial Rome, where strict adherence to the legal rule of monogamy left quite a few emperors without a legitimate biological son, leading on more than one occasion to dynastic instability. Almost all of the many women who populated the Neo-Assyrian harems remain nameless to us. But two types of Assyrian royal women in particular played more prominent roles. The mother of the king, Umishari, and the king's chief consort, whose rather bland title, palace woman, Isi-Ikali or Segadu, obscures the fact that she effectively served as Assyria's queen. In most cases, the palace woman was probably also the mother of the crown prince. Given their unrestrained access to the king, both the queen mother and the ruler's chief consort could wield enormous influence, including in the political sphere. Esarhaddon, in fact, apparently relied heavily not only on his mother Nikir, but also on his wife, named Ashara-Hamat. Ashurnasirpal's death on the 12th day of the month of Adaru, 672 BCE, is recorded in the Babylonian Chronicle, a source not generally inclined to indulge in idle gossip. She was buried with great pomp in a mausoleum in Ashur, and regular funerary offerings were established for her. Even dead, the royal spouse continued to make an impact. According to a letter written shortly after her passing, a ghost had appeared to her son, the crown prince Ashurnasirpal, and had blessed him, saying, "May his descendants rule over Assyria." The letter writer, anxious that the dead queen be properly remembered, adds, "Honoring the gods bring forth good. Honoring the gods of the underworld restores life." Another woman of consequence during Esarhaddon's reign was Nakia's sister, Abiramu, who was mentioned in the legal document about a land lease from 674 BCE. While her economic activities are thus well documented, it is less certain but possible that she also held an important political position. An individual by the name of Abiramu, which was borne by men as well as women, is known to have served under Esarhaddon as Grand Vizier, governor of the western land of Hanagalbat, an eponym of the year 677 BCE. And even though this official is nowhere identified as female, it is tempting to think that Nakia's sister might have been the one to hold these positions. Royal women, after all, had a lot of authority during Esarhaddon's reign, and the position of Grand Vizier and Governor or King of Hanagalbat was traditionally given to a member of the Assyrian royal family. The last prominent incumbent had been Sargon II's brother, Sin-Ahu-Ushur. Since Esarhaddon could not trust his brothers who had been involved in the plot to kill their father after all, it would have made sense for him to choose his aunt instead, the sister of his beloved mother, to hold the age-old office. Until a few decades ago, very little was known about Assyrian royal women from the period prior to the reigns of Sennacherib and Esarhaddon. A few short references in royal inscriptions to Semiramis, the wife of Shemshi-Adad V and mother of Adad-Nirari III, was almost all scholars were able to work with. This changed dramatically in the late 1980s, when Iraqi archaeologists, led by Muzahim Mahmud Hussein, made a number of stunning discoveries in the southern domestic wing of Ashurnasirpal II's northwest palace in Kala. In the spring of 1988, the excavators had observed an unevenness in the brick floor of a room labeled MM. When they removed the flooring, they found a 9th century BCE subterranean burial chamber, accessible by means of a shaft with a stairway. It held a terracotta sarcophagus containing the body of an unidentified female, or perhaps a eunuch, a silver bowl, some gold jewelry, a collection of cylinder seals, and other precious items. Also found, and very much in line with a harem setting, were 3 finely glazed terracotta sculptures depicting erotic scenes. A man penetrating a woman from behind, another man kneeling over a woman lying on her back, and an act of fellatio. The discoveries made below the floor of room MM suggested that the southern wing of the Northwest Palace might house burial chambers of additional royal women. And in 1989, the Iraqi excavators set out to search for such structures. Their efforts were rewarded spectacularly. Under the floors of 2 rooms farther west of room MM, they came across 2 more vaulted burial chambers with a number of sarcophagi. The harem women at Tala had apparently lived their lives with their dead predecessors directly below their feet. Even though they had been disturbed in antiquity, the newly found tombs were still filled with enormous amounts of jewelry and other valuable artifacts, some imported from the West. Crowns, earrings, necklaces, bracelets, anklets, beads, stamp and cylinder seals, amulets, mirrors, fibulae, textiles, and a variety of vessels. Many objects were made of gold, but there were also artifacts made of silver, bronze, ivory, and other materials. Several pieces of jewelry were inlaid with beautifully cut semi-precious stones. It was a once-in-a-lifetime discovery, on a par with the famous treasures from Tutankhamun's tomb from the Valley of Kings in Thebes. If the artifacts from the Kala tombs never received the same amount of attention, This is because they were soon stored away in Iraq's central bank in Baghdad, where they barely survived massive bombing campaigns conducted during the First and Second Gulf Wars in 1991 and 2003. Unlike the first tomb, the two burial chambers found in 1989 produced texts that revealed a lot about the royal women who were interred in them. The older of them, Tomb 3, as it was soon called, held a large alabaster sarcophagus that had been rubbed and was found empty. But based on the inscription on its lid, it could be ascribed to a woman with the elaborate Assyrian name Mulissu-Makanishat-Ninwar, who was the queen, literally palace woman, of Ashurnasirpal II, king of Assyria, and of Shalmaneser III, king of Assyria. The curse, continued on a stone tablet found in the tomb's antechamber, warned that no one later may place herein anyone else, whether some harem woman or queen, nor remove this sarcophagus from its place. Whoever removes this sarcophagus from its place, his spirit will not receive funerary offerings along with the other spirits. It is a taboo of the sun god Shamash and the netherworld goddess Ereshkigal. The text then states, "As for me, the daughter of Ashur-nikah-Dain, chief cupbearer of Ashurnasirpal II, king of Assyria, anyone who later removes my seat from before the spirits of the dead, may his spirit receive no food. May someone later clothe me with a shroud, anoint me with oil, and sacrifice a sheep for me." Mulissu-Makanishat-Ninwar's anxiety that her final resting place might one day be violated was well founded. Her sarcophagus, after all, was already empty by the time it was found. But thanks to the funerary inscriptions she left, her memory was preserved, and we know a great deal about this eminent 9th century royal woman. She was the main consort of Ashurnasirpal II, and kept her title of an Assyrian queen under his successor Shalmaneser III, who was most likely her son. She was, moreover, the daughter of a high-ranking Assyrian official, the chief cupbearer Ashur-nikah-Dain. Early in Ashurnasirpal's time, in other words, when the king still resided in Ashur, at least some of the most powerful Assyrian officials were not yet eunuchs, but members of old Assyrian families with children of their own. And the king married into this very aristocracy. Many of the Assyrian queens who followed Mulissu-Makanishat-Ninwar bore West Semitic rather than Assyrian names, which suggests a shift in the marriage practices among Assyrian rulers in the wake of Ashurnasirpal II's move to Karla. From this time forth, the Assyrian monarchs made a concerted effort to concentrate power in their own hands, at the expense of the old elite families, and apparently no longer married women from the highest echelons of Assyrian society. This did not mean, however, that the women now rising to the position of queen were any less influential. On the contrary, some of them became extremely powerful. Semiramis, the wife of Shamshi-Adad V, and model of the later Greek Semiramis legend, served as a sort of regent when her son Adad-nirari III ascended the throne, and she clearly was involved in military campaigns and foreign affairs. Presumably, Semiramis was buried at Karla as well, though her final resting place has not yet been discovered. But in the antechamber of Mulissu-Makanishat-Ninwar's tomb, in a bronze sarcophagus deposited there under circumstances that remain obscure, the mortal remains of another Assyrian queen were found. A gold-stamped seal pendant, placed around her neck before she was buried, identifies her as Harma, queen, literally palace woman, of Shalmaneser IV, king of Assyria, and daughter-in-law of Adad-nirari III. The imagery on the seal shows the queen praying to a goddess, most likely Ishtar or Mulissu, who is sitting on a throne supported by a recumbent lion. To the left of the throne, a supersized scorpion is depicted, a widely used symbol of Assyrian queens and their households. Queens guaranteed the continuity of the royal line, and female scorpions, which tend to ruthlessly defend their offspring with their poisonous tails, were considered ideal models of motherhood. As revealed by our scientific examination of her bones conducted in 1997 at the University of Göttingen, Harma was between 18 and 20 years old when she died. As an infant, she had survived a severe illness, and she suffered from poor teeth and chronic sinusitis. Despite her young age at the time of her death and the relative insignificance of her husband, Shalmaneser IV reigned 782 to 773 BCE. Amma was buried with enormously rich grave goods, most importantly a spectacularly beautiful golden crown decorated with leaves, flowers, pomegranates, grape clusters, and winged female figures fashioned out of gold and semi-precious stones. It was placed on her head at the time of her internment. Amma's family background is unclear. In 773 BCE, Shalmaneser IV's last year in power, the king's influential field marshal, Shamshi-Ilu, had undertaken a campaign against Hadiarnu, the ruler of Damascus, and brought back rich tribute to Assyria, including a daughter of Hadiarnu and her dowry. It could be that Harma was this very daughter, and that she died together with Shalmaneser, perhaps violently, when the latter passed away a few months later. But this is entirely speculative. The finds made in 1989 in yet another burial chamber in the Northwest Palace, soon dubbed Tomb 2, was stunning as well. The chamber contained a stone sarcophagus with the skeletal remains of two slightly later Assyrian queens, along with a remarkable array of jewelry and other grave goods. Based on inscriptional evidence, the woman at the bottom of the sarcophagus can be identified with some confidence as Yarba, the main consort of Tiglath-Pileser III. An alabaster tablet discovered in a niche of the tomb is inscribed with a curse on her behalf. Whoever in the future, be it a queen who sits on the throne or some harem woman who is the love interest of the king, removes me from my tomb, or puts anybody else with me, and lays his hand upon my jewelry with evil intent, or breaks open the seal of this tomb, above, under the rays of the sun, let his spirit roam outside in thirst. Below in the underworld, when the water libation ceremony is carried out, he must not receive with the infernal Anunnaki gods any funerary offerings in the form of beer, wine, or food. Just as in the case of Mulasumukanashat Ninwa, the curse, which provides interesting insights into the Neo-Assyrian funerary cult, failed in the end to protect the queen's corpse from undue interference. At some point, her sarcophagus was opened and a second woman's mortal remains were placed on top of hers. The remains of this second woman have been identified as those of Italia, chief consort of Sargon II. Her name and title are engraved on a beautiful golden bowl that was placed upon the dead queen's breast. As mentioned earlier, Italia's name is identical with that of the daughter of a 9th century Israelite king, which has led to speculation that she might have been of Israelite or Judean extraction. This suggestion remains highly conjectural, however. Even though she served for a while as Sargon II's queen, Italia, as also mentioned earlier, was probably not the mother of Sennacherib, the king's crown prince and eventual successor. Sennacherib is instead now thought to have been the son of a woman by the West Semitic name of Raima, which means the beloved, to whom a monumental stela in Arsha was dedicated. If the poorly preserved inscription on it has been read correctly, it calls Raima mother of Sennacherib, king of the world, king of Assyria, but notably not palace woman of Sargon II, presumably because of Sennacherib's reluctance to invoke the memory of his father after the latter's inauspicious death on the battlefield in 705 BCE. Given her West Semitic background, it is likely that Raima conversed with her son in Aramaic, whereas Sargon spoke Assyrian with Sennacherib. If one were to psychoanalyze Sennacherib, one could speculate that this form of gendered communication instilled in the young prince a long-lasting notion of an aggressive, conquering Assyria, represented by his father, and a more passive, yielding, and feminine Western periphery, embodied by his mother. Raima seems to have lived longer than Yarba and Italia, who were both in their 30s when they died. She was still active in 692 BCE when a death note from Nineveh mentions the mother of the king. At that time, she must have been about 70 years old. Similar to queens and queen mothers, and in the case of Abiramu, a sister of the queen mother, the sisters and daughters of Assyrian kings occasionally gained considerable prominence. Some were married off to foreign rulers, when clearly it was hoped that they would keep an eye on their husbands and make sure they remained loyal political vassals. Not always did such schemes succeed. Sargon II's daughter Arhat Abisha, for example, who had become the wife of Ambaris, the powerful king of Bit-Puratash in central Anatolia, failed to prevent her spouse from rebelling against Sargon. The insurrection ended in 713 BCE with Ambaris' defeat, and he and his family were deported to Assyria, although Arhat Abisha's ultimate fate remains unknown. It is also not clear what became of a daughter of Esarhaddon who was apparently married off to Batatur, a king of the Scythians mentioned by Herodotus under the name Protiphus. A cuneiform oracle query addressed to the sun god reveals that Esarhaddon considered the marriage an opportunity to end a period of conflict with the Scythians and win them as allies. One Assyrian princess, Sheruah-Eterat, rose to a position of considerable authority at the Assyrian court. The eldest daughter of King Esarhaddon and sister of his successor Ashurnasirpal, Sheruah-Eterat never suffered from a lack of self-confidence. During the period when Ashurnasirpal was still crown prince, she wrote a bullying letter to Ashurnasirpal's wife Liballi-Sharat, making it quite clear that as a blood relation of the Assyrian royal family, she, Sheruah-Eterat, held a far higher rank than her sister-in-law. Adding insult to injury, she even mocked Liballi-Sharat's attempts to follow the example of her intellectually inclined husband and dabble in the scribal arts. Why don't you just write your tablets and recite your exercise? But during the waning years of Esarhaddon's reign, the most influential member of the Assyrian royal family continued to be Nakia. In fact, the power of this formidable woman reached its peak in the weeks after Esarhaddon's death in the fall of 669, when she became the guardian of his succession arrangement. Esarhaddon, who had at least 18 children, had made the unconventional decision to have a younger son of his, Ashurbanipal, replace him on the Assyrian throne, while an older one, Shamash-Shumuukin, would become the next king of Babylon. Following the example of his father Sennacherib, Esarhaddon had enforced a long series of loyalty oaths on his Assyrian subjects and foreign-client kings to make sure they would respect this scheme. At some point during the 22 days between Esarhaddon's passing and Ashurbanipal's accession to the Assyrian throne, Nakia imposed her own loyalty oaths on the Assyrian citizens. The tablet from Nineveh that records these oaths calls her Zakutu rather than Nakia, giving the Assyrian translation of her West Semitic name. The treaty that Zakutu, a palace woman of Sennacherib, king of Assyria, and mother of Esarhaddon, king of Assyria, concluded with Shamash-Shumuukin, his, Ashurbanipal's, favorite brother, with Shamash-Metu-Ubalit, and the rest of his brothers with the royal seed, when the magnates and governors, the bearded and the eunuchs, with Assyrians high and low. Anyone who is included in this treaty that Zakutu, the palace woman, has concluded with all the people of the land concerning her cherished grandson Ashurbanipal, any one of you who should fabricate and carry out an ugly and evil scheme, or a revolt against your lord Ashurbanipal, king of Assyria, make Ashur, Sin, Shamash, Jupiter, Venus, Saturn, Mercury, Mars, and Sirius punish him. When Ashurbanipal assumed power, apparently without facing any serious opposition, Nakia had fulfilled her final mission. A little later, she either retired from public life or passed away. It seems that for reasons that remain unclear, Nakia's role as Assyria's foremost female politician was not passed on to Ashurbanipal's wife Liballi-Sharat, but rather to his sister, Sheruah-Eterat. A papyrus from Egypt written in Egypt's Demotic script, but in the Aramaic language, provides a fictionalized account of a peacekeeping mission undertaken by Sheruah-Eterat during a bloody civil war fought from 652 to 648 BCE between Ashurbanipal, the king of Assyria, and his brother Shamash-Shumuukin, at the time king of Babylon. A fragmentary cuneiform letter from Nineveh mentions Sheruah-Eterat and the later Babylonian king Kandalanu in connection with the eastern land of Elam, which further strengthens the assumption that the princess, very much like Nakia a few decades earlier, helped shape Assyria's politics vis-a-vis its southern and southeastern neighbors. Libali-Sharat, Ashurnasirpal's wife, seems never to have carried out political tasks of comfortable significance, even though she managed to overcome the disdain initially shown to her by some members of the royal family. A monumental stela from Ashur is decorated with an image of her on which she wears a magnificent mural crown, a crown in the shape of a city wall. And one of the most famous artworks from ancient Mesopotamia, a relief from Ashurnasirpal's North Palace at Nineveh, depicts her banqueting with her husband beneath an arbor of vines, while musicians play merry tunes. But even for Libali-Sharat, a carefree life was not really in the cards. Showered with favors as she was also confronted with the dark side of imperial politics. She witnessed vicious acts of violence, and had to worry about possible conspiracies and other attacks on the royal family. On one occasion, making use of her unusual familiarity with the scribal arts, Libali-Sharat seems to have asked a god if a political plot against Ashurnasirpal would result in the assassination of herself and her royal husband. I ask you, God Lahara, our creator, this rumor of an impending rebellion that has been reported to Ashurnasirpal, king of Assyria, by people saying they will instigate a rebellion against you, is it decreed and confirmed? Will it happen? Is it true? Will they attack me? Will I die? Will they capture me in the course of it? The query ends with the words addressed to the god. Disregard that a woman has written this tablet and placed it before you. Although enormously privileged, Assyrian royal women clearly did not have the same opportunities and freedoms the men around them enjoyed. As Libali-Sharat's query reveals, they could not even speak to their gods without apologizing. Still, as members of the kings in a circle, Assyrian queens and princesses played roles that had far greater political implications than the shenanigans of the minor royals who were the bread and butter of modern tabloid journalism. As described above, women were particularly influential during Esarhaddon's reign, a time full of ups and downs. Assyrian armies scored some great victories, but inside Assyria, a number of rebellions occurred that shook the empire to its core. Even Nakia, her considerable political talents notwithstanding, could not prevent these crises. Perhaps the outsized role she had gotten used to playing actually contributed to them. It was in 671 BCE that the political drama of Esarhaddon's tumultuous last years reached its peak.